All right, welcome to week one where we talk about chapter one for e-commerce. And I had a question last night about the YouTube lectures. So before I get started on the lecture, I just wanted to clarify where those are located. So the lectures are located in UJA and iLearn on the left side. There's a link there. If you prefer the YouTube version, the YouTube link is at the top of the syllabus on the right-hand side. Okay? And then from there, you can subscribe to my channel, and then there's a playlist specifically for this course. Okay, so if you do that, you'll see the lectures as they get posted to YouTube. And like I said before, it doesn't really matter which one you use. Okay? So in this course, we're going to talk about e-commerce. And so e-commerce has been around for roughly about 26 years or so, give or take. Okay. In its early days, it was fairly rudimentary. I worked for an early e-commerce provider that provided the first internet payment system. Okay. The e-commerce back then is vastly different than what we see today. Now, as part of your first homework assignment, you will be going out to the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine and pulling up examples of an e-commerce platform back in the 90s or early 2000s versus something today that you would see. So perhaps you're going to go look at Sears back then versus Sears today, and then you're going to write about that and answer the questions that I posed to you. But e-commerce's current state is vastly different than it was when e-commerce got started. When e-commerce first started, you really couldn't purchase things online directly. You had to pick up the phone and call someone to give your credit card information, or you had to mail a check. So even when eBay started, their first payment mechanism for eBay was you go online, you do an auction, and then you mail a check to eBay's headquarters. Okay? So we've come a long way from there. And along the way, we've had things that have been developed like mobile technology. So the iPhone really changed the way that we do commerce with respect to things like being able to do mobile payments and mobile applications and things like that. So why is e-commerce important? Well, as you've seen with this whole COVID situation, we're doing a lot of e-commerce right now. Maybe not as much as we did a few months ago when we were under lockdown, but we're still doing an enormous amount of e-commerce in the world today. Okay? And so e-commerce uses the internet and the portion of the internet that we refer to as the World Wide Web, as well as mobile apps and browsers to do business transactions. And these can be consumer level transactions that you and I encounter when we go and buy something on Amazon. They can be B2B transactions where we have businesses purchasing from other businesses. They can be government based transactions, either consumer to government, where I'm going out and doing a transaction with the DMV to register my car. Or they could be even government to government or government to business transactions. Okay. And so e-business is when we digitally enable transactions within a firm. So this is when we have information systems that are controlled by that firm. E-commerce is when we use the internet to transact business. And so if we look at the overlap, and there's a great diagram on page 10 of the 2019 edition, just happened to be the edition I grabbed off my desk. But there's a diagram that shows at the beginning of chapter one, the difference between e-commerce and e-business. It's kind of a Venn diagram, okay? So on one side, we have our suppliers and our e-business systems. And on the other side, we have our customers and our e-commerce systems. And in the middle, we have the company. okay, and our technology infrastructure. Now, I know it's a little basic for everybody these days, but let's just talk about some of the basics of things like the internet. Okay, so the internet is a worldwide network of computer networks. Okay, and those computer networks use common standards to communicate. You could think of their standards, or they're known as protocols, as the language of how devices on the internet talk to one another. Okay? And so we connect to the internet using some sort of physical connection or radio-based connection to the worldwide network of connections that we call the internet. Okay, and the internet has hosts on it, and those hosts have what we call DNS names, or domain name service. Okay? And so this is what we use as sort of the phone book for the internet. So when we go to www.google.com, that's just like going onto our phone and picking out our friend's name. Even if we don't know their number or their number changes, we know that that's their name, and we can reliably use that to contact our friends. Okay? Now, the World Wide Web, or what we call the web today, is an information system that runs on the internet. The World Wide Web is just a system on the internet. There are other systems on the internet. So email's a system on the internet. File transfer protocol is a system on the internet. Not used a whole lot anymore, but it's still used by some. Okay? The web is what we use mostly these days, that and mobile applications. And so the web allows us to utilize what's called a server to serve information and a browser to browse information. So by building applications that run inside of a web browser, we have the ability to produce a number of services that allow us to find information, allow us to purchase things, and allow us to communicate with others. Okay? Now, mobile platforms are very similar to web-based platforms, except that on a mobile platform, you're either using a much more limited feature browser, or you're using a mobile application that connects to a system on the back end. And a lot of times these days, it's some sort of web-based system that we connect to through a mobile application. So Facebook's a really great example of this. Facebook's application that runs on your phone does not have a whole lot to it. It is a user interface to a back-end system. And it's actually a very lightweight user interface because it's effectively just a wrapper for the website. Okay? Now, there are different areas of the web. So there's the visible web, the things that we can see, and that's a majority of the web. So that's about, according to the textbook in figure 1.2, this is about 130 trillion web pages, okay, that Google's identified. Then there's the deep web, and the deep web is things that are not indexable by Google and other search engines. So this could be subscription content, the things that are behind the paywall at the New York Times and other publications. This could be databases that are owned by corporations, governments, medical, legal, academic. Okay? Things like Westlaw, LexisNexis, those are legal research databases. The academic databases that you use when you're doing your classes, that sort of thing. And then there's also encrypted content, and encryption is a way to secure information and prevent people from seeing what's inside it. So an example that you may have, if you took my 101 class, you may have been there and we passed around the secret message in class, and it was contained within an encrypted box. Okay? That's an example of using security on the internet and something we wouldn't be able to have access to. Okay? All right. As far as internet access goes within the US, it's obviously a little different here in the US than it might be in other countries. But we have about 75% of the population has both a computer access and mobile internet access. Okay? About 8% only have a computer access, no mobile access to the internet, and about 16% only have access to the mobile internet. All right, let's go ahead and shift on. So let's talk about some trends in e-commerce over the last few years. So retail e-commerce has continued to grow exponentially, and even bigger over the last few months with COVID going on. So many organizations had to shift 100% to e-commerce. So that really grew for them. And businesses that otherwise would have never adopted e-commerce were forced to do so. We're also seeing even higher growth rates above the 15% in the US in other countries, particularly in Asia Pacific, Africa, and the Middle East. Okay? And this coincides with growth in internet access for those individuals in those areas. Now, mobile e-commerce has been growing exponentially. So it's around 300 billion, give or take, in terms of mobile e-commerce. I would suspect that this year that's going to grow even more. We also have seen an increase in our mobile app ecosystem. So a vast majority of Americans use smartphone apps. And in other countries, that's even higher. So there's some Asian countries where mobile phone use is even higher penetration than it is in the US. Okay? And Korea comes to mind, Japan come to mind as well. Social commerce, which is based on using your social networks, that's growing. And so that, although it's a very small number still, it's only about $6.5 billion, it's growing exponentially. Local e-commerce, so this is where we are using e-commerce to grow in local areas. This has grown as well. So things like our Ubers, our Lyfts, that sort of thing. Airbnb. This is around $115 billion in e-commerce revenue that's considered local. Okay. What might be surprising, though, is the B2B e-commerce revenue. And the US alone, that's over $6 trillion for B2B, business to business, e-commerce. This is your Oracles of the world purchasing their office supplies through an electronic method of Office Depot, for example, or Staples. And so a lot of large organizations build functionality into their financial systems that allow employees to just directly purchase things through a website, just like they would if they were consumers, but it's all part of the back office systems, and POs are generated, it's automatically paid for, it's automatically shipped to the right address for a particular employee. Okay. On-demand services, I mentioned Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, those types of services are continuing to grow. They're bringing in a lot of outside capital for growth. And their growth within their business, setting COVID aside, was very substantial. Okay. Now, what that means for those businesses going forward, I really don't know at this point. We'll just have to see how that plays out. Mobile advertising is much higher now than normal advertising on digital. So over 70% of digital spending on advertising is on mobile ads. Okay, so you're starting to see those permeate your devices even more. Even small businesses who couldn't afford to launch an e-commerce presence, either they were forced to do so by COVID, or they had already started doing so because it's much more affordable for them to do so. If we were 20 years ago, it would be impossible for these mom and pop shops to have an e-commerce presence. Okay, so we've had a lot of growth there. On the technology side, we've had a lot of technology growth over the last 20 years. So 20 years ago, there were no smartphones. There were mobile phones, but they were fairly rudimentary. There was, starting around 2000, there was a web browser for some cell phones. It was absolutely abysmal. Okay, I speak from experience because I had one on my phone. Um, you weren't doing any e-commerce with it. You were barely doing, checking Yahoo or Google or whatever, right? We also have things like smart speakers that have come about. So, you can see behind me, maybe I've got a smart speaker back there. And so that even enables e-commerce as well. So, uh, you know, if yours is an Alexa one, mine is not, but if yours is an Alexa one, you can actually do reorders on Amazon with it. So now it's another form of convenience for smoothing the channel for customers to interact with your business and actually purchase something. Okay. Cloud computing. This is a very important trend. So cloud computing is really enabling e-commerce transformations. So if you've taken my other classes, you know that cloud is an enabler for many businesses. And it's also a way to make things a bit more equal for businesses in terms of being able to deploy information systems and e-commerce platforms. Okay. So this allows us to use any connected internet device to access content. So in addition to traditional e-commerce platforms using cloud, we ourselves can use cloud for our own purposes and consume it as a transactional platform. So if I need storage capacity for my photos, I can purchase storage space from a number of different providers through a cloud-based mechanism. So now instead of me spending additional money for storage on my local computer, I can store it in the cloud and access that information from any device. Then we talk about Internet of Things, IoT. So some of you might be supply chain majors. It's going to be very interesting to think about how IoT is going to affect supply chain. It's, within our homes, we're using IoT for cameras and doorbells and locks and smoke alarms and things like that. But it'll be very interesting to see how IoT develops to be used for other purposes, particularly in the supply chain space. Being able to track goods and customer behaviors based on IoT devices, that's pretty darn interesting. And there's a Walmart lab store where they have AI and IoT devices that are tracking customer behavior as they shop in the store. And customers know this. It's not like they hide it. They've got a big glass window with all the computers that are processing the data. The cameras are very obvious. They're everywhere. And they tell you when you walk into the store, this is a test store. And so they're learning about customer behaviors, which enables from a supply chain, where customers are expecting to look for things, what their purchasing habits, what they purchase with each other, which enables Walmart to get smarter about getting products to the customers as quickly as possible. But also from a marketing perspective, it allows you to market to those customers based on preferences. So if you want to target a particular type of customer, then you can get really creative in your merchandising displays. Okay, you might even pop up coupons or something like that on the user's phone when they walk to a certain area of the store. Data, so big data. This is another key aspect of e-commerce these days. Big data allows us to track all of that information. So we've got IoT devices, we've got cloud, we've got artificial intelligence going on. All these things require data or produce data. So now we have these big data environments that we can use as an organization to better understand our customers. So big data is another key area of e-commerce these days. Okay? And then to go through that data, we use business analytics. And so business analytics allow us to go through and identify trends in that big source of data. And to help facilitate analytics these days, a lot of times organizations are making use of artificial intelligence, particularly machine learning, and then a subset of machine learning is deep learning. So you've got artificial intelligence, you've got machine learning, which is a subset of AI, and then within a subset of machine learning, you have what's called deep learning. And so deep learning has been enabled in just the last 10 years by the prevalence of graphic processing units like the ones from NVIDIA and AMD. Maybe you're a gamer and you're familiar with that. Those allow you to actually process data much more quickly and analyze it. Okay. And then we have things from a society perspective of e-commerce. We have things like user-generated content. Okay, that's being monetized in organizations like Facebook and Instagram. Your content becomes the product that is sold. Okay, uh, privacy issues are coming into play in e-commerce. In the US, we don't have very tough privacy laws. The exception being the state of California this year uh, basically turned a law on that helps with privacy, but it's not as good as other countries have. In the European Union, they have the toughest privacy laws in the world. And so the GDPR, which is the EU's privacy law, is very restrictive and may apply to businesses anywhere in the world, whether they're in Europe or not. Okay, so these are all things e-commerce sites have to think about. Um, you have the market dominance of the key players, so the Facebooks, Amazons, Googles, Microsofts. Okay. That could lead to changes in the way that we regulate those businesses. You've got conflicts over copyright. You've got rules from different courts about how to collect sales tax um, and other laws that relate to businesses that could be varying from state to state and country to country. There can be issues of surveillance. So, things like the Patriot Act involve surveillance. Privacy incursions. So as privacy laws become tougher and tougher, they can be privacy incursions, and that can affect e-commerce as well. Online security is a never-ending battle. So, any organization who claims that they have bulletproof security, military-grade encryption, and things like that, I'd be wary of that because online security is a moving target. It's not a set it and forget it. We're not talking about the Ronco food dehydrator here. We don't set it and forget it. We're talking about a moving target that we constantly have to be vigilant about and ensure that we bake that into our e-commerce facilities. Spam is a huge issue. It distracts people from real legitimate messaging. And then we end up with things like on-demand services, particularly in e-commerce. Things like Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, where we have maybe Instacart's another example, where we've got maybe new jobs, but they're maybe not well paying and they're more temporary than anything else. Okay, and so there's a ballot measure going on about I think it's Uber and Lyft drivers, if I'm not mistaken, and it has to do with whether they're classified as an employee or independent contractor. This is something that organizations have to think about as well. And so, all of you who are voters in California are going to make the decision on which way that goes. Who knows? But that's a big uncertainty for organizations as well, regardless as to what side of the issue you happen to fall on, right? So let's talk about some of the features of e-commerce. Okay? So e-commerce provides a rich experience these days. It didn't always provide a rich experience, but it does today. Okay? So we have multiple forms of media that can be embedded in our e-commerce. It's ubiquitous. It's available anywhere and everywhere. So it doesn't matter what device we have, we can conduct e-commerce. It has a global reach, so no longer do we have to only sell to our local neighborhood. We can actually sell to individuals anywhere in the world that we want to. Okay, so there's a lot of capabilities there. Universal standards these days, so a lot of times we end up with standards that we can just leverage for any e-commerce site. Social technologies, so if you build an e-commerce presence these days, a lot of times you build social aspects to that. You can have personalization of your e-commerce experience these days. It wasn't always that way, but now you can. Information density, interactivity, so we want to have an interactive experience. And that really covers key areas of e-commerce. Okay. Now, let's talk about, let's actually just kind of shift on to the types of e-commerce now. Okay. So we have business to consumer, which I spoke about earlier a little bit. This is where we have a business that sells to an individual consumer. This is what we think of generally when we talk about e-commerce. But as I talked about earlier, this is not the largest form of e-commerce in the US. Okay? It does grow significantly every year, but it's still not to the level of B2B e-commerce. Okay? B2B e-commerce or business to business is where businesses sell to other businesses. This is the largest form. Okay? And so this is the one I told you had about $6 trillion in transactions a couple of years ago. Okay? So in terms of B2B exchanges in general, B2B commerce, the total market is around 13 trillion. So right now, e-commerce is about 50% of that. Okay. So there's still some pretty big growth opportunities there. Then we have consumer to consumer. So this allows us to do marketplaces with other consumers. So a good example is if you've ever sold anything on OfferUp. Okay. So it's a marketplace where we can sell our junk to someone who thinks it's a treasure. Okay. And then we also have things like Etsy or eBay, eBay being one of the original ones, okay, but Etsy being for custom developed things that we create ourselves. So like a creator's marketplace. Then we have mobile e-commerce, so we can do mobile commerce though. And so this allows us to do commerce right from our phone and our cellular connection. Okay. And so things like if I purchase something from my phone, I buy an airline ticket, I book a hotel, that sort of thing, okay, where I'm just using the mobile app for that. Social commerce, where I purchase something through a social network. So the only thing I've ever purchased is if you took my class over the summer, the little animation software for doing lectures. That's the only thing I've ever purchased through social media. But some people purchase a lot of things from that. Okay? Local e-commerce is a growing area. And so this is where we're focused on purchases in my current geographic area. So if I'm purchasing things online in my local area, so say it's a local supermarket, maybe it's a convenience store down the street, that might be considered local e-commerce. Okay. So let's talk about some of the growth of e-commerce and kind of the history behind it. So where I like to think of e-commerce is around the early 90s, okay, early to mid 90s. But the reality is e-commerce in a way existed before that. So you had systems like that were very primitive, but you might have a modem, which a modem was how you got on the internet before broadband. So you would have a modem that connected to your computer and to the phone line. And say you were a large business, you could reorder supplies by having a computer automatically dial up to a modem on the other end at some supply company and transmit the data directly to them to place your order. And so back in the 70s, there are examples of this being used in the healthcare industry. Okay. In the 1980s, I recall as a kid in the 80s, this being something that the company my dad worked for, they reordered their supplies with a computer that was attached to a modem, which would just automatically upload their inventory and or reorder their supplies and things that they needed for certain things. Okay, you had systems overseas that were deployed in, say, France, that allowed you to do some basic shopping from your home using a little terminal. You also had things like Prodigy, CompuServe, AOL in the US, which allowed you to do online purchasing through precursors to the internet. So you had e-commerce and things like that. Okay. let's see, around 1994, you had First Virtual Holdings invented e-commerce, so to speak, and they invented something called the virtual PIN. And so the virtual PIN allowed you to shop online. The idea behind First Virtual, the story is from the founders at least, that a couple of them they didn't know each other at the time. They were in an airport, and the CEO at the time encountered this guy on his laptop, and he had a uh, telephone wire from it hooked up to a payphone. And he had a device coupled over the payphone receiver, and it caught this CEO, well, he wasn't CEO at the time, but anyways, caught his attention, and he struck up a conversation with the guy. And the guy said, yeah, I'm checking my email, and he had no idea what email was. And so they got to chatting about it, and one of them, I don't know which one, said, you know, it'd be really cool with this internet thing if you could sell a joke a day for $1. You could make a lot of money that way. And they laughed and said, well, this is not even possible because you can't sell anything on the internet. There's just no commerce. Well, fast forward, they formed a company because they decided to build an e-commerce platform. And so they built it down in our neck of the woods, in the San Diego area. And so that's where the birth of e-commerce, from my perspective, is. The patents used by that organization that they owned are now owned by companies like PayPal and eBay, which are e-commerce giants. So this organization launched the first platform to do payments online using your credit card in a secure manner. And it leveraged the internet, your web browser, email, and then some other offline technologies to handle your credit card aspect. And so that allowed you to purchase information and later actual physical goods. So started with information like a joke a day, other types of information. You can use your imagination as to what that might have been. But then it kind of shifted over to physical goods and services. And then you started having sites like eBay pop up, eBay doing physical goods, eventually PayPal and eBay merged, and then you had a proliferation of other e-commerce companies, some that failed, some that succeeded. So, you know, Pets.com, Webvan were notable failures in the e-commerce space. But Amazon is a huge success. Okay? So we go through different periods of e-commerce. And so the early days, the book says 1995. I would argue around 1994, because that's when these companies really started off. That's where you have the invention of online retail. So from 1995 to 2000, you had a huge amount of growth of companies just trying to start up some sort of online retail. In the 2000 to 2007 timeframe, you had the second phase where we consolidated it down. It was a lot of companies went out of business around 2000, 2001. That's the first .com implosion. Okay, and then we had around 2007, we had the launch of the smartphone. And so the smartphone really ramped up the next piece. So we had a reinvention. We started seeing social media take off. We started seeing mobile apps developed. And we also started seeing hyper-local content and hyper-local shopping where we could shop locally from our mobile device and then just go pick it up, or it would be delivered to us. Okay? That was a growth in retail along that entire period. Services started coming into play around 1999, 2000, in the early days of services being available for purchase on the internet. Okay, so Orbitz and Travelocity, XP, hotels, we purchase hotels and plane tickets and things like that. Okay, then from there it moved into content. So content started happening around the early to middle 2010s, roughly. Okay. And it's just starting to really ramp up a bit more where people are willing to pay for content. So you've got the Apple Musics, the Spotify's, newspaper subscriptions online, magazines, streaming video services galore. That's really starting to take off now. And now you're starting to see, as you may have seen at the Apple product launch, there were people doing all sorts of different types of content now. Apple's got a whole bunch of different content that they're bundling together. So now you're starting to see the rise of content bundling on the content side. Okay? And so starting with 2007 forward, we kind of consider that the Web 2.0. Okay? Now, there's still things going on. IoT, AI, cloud, these are all things that are still going on. Okay? Now, let's talk about a few other areas before we wrap up this unit for today. So we're getting close to the end of the chapter here. We're within the home stretch. Okay? So let's talk about e-commerce and some of the themes. So technology infrastructure has really developed over the last couple of decades. But we have to take a step back to the development of the internet roughly around 50 years ago or so. Okay? The internet was originally developed for academic and military purposes. Okay? And it was really designed to provide for communication in the event of nuclear war. Okay? So that's what it was originally developed for. It was a military invention. It shifted to education, and it was used a lot by education. In the 1980s, the National Science Foundation took over the operation from the internet, and you started to see it proliferate into colleges, universities, and eventually towards the 90s, you saw it actually proliferating into the secondary and post-secondary education systems. Okay. By the middle of the 1990s, you started seeing this become conducive to e-commerce, okay, and being used in businesses. That's when businesses started seeing email and things like that. Okay. But the technologies are things like that we have today are things like cloud computing. But that wouldn't be possible without other enabling technologies that we have. Today we have desktop computers, laptops, that sort of thing, smartphones, tablets. We have networks. Almost every home, I should say. Almost every home has a local area network these days. We have different types of databases for different types of needs. We've seen an evolution from client-server computing to web-based computing to cloud computing. We have data mining going on, and now we even have fiber optics and high-speed wireless networks taking prevalence in homes and businesses. Okay. On the business side, we had things like enterprise information systems, ERP systems, supply chain systems, CRM or customer relationship management systems. E-commerce relies on all of these technologies as well as the internet. So e-commerce alone cannot rely solely on the internet. There are a lot of complex features that go into this. So the next time you think that simply because an organization is moving their operations to an e-commerce format, gosh, they should lower their prices, you've got to think about what all of that technology costs and all the infrastructure that goes into it. So it's not always a net reduction in costs. Sometimes it's just a shifting of costs to other areas. Okay. Excuse me. So we have things that underlie e-commerce, like payroll systems, accounting, marketing, HR, finance, design, sharing of information, project management, email, ERP systems, HR planning systems, supply chains, customer relationship management, and then the actual e-commerce platform that has to be able to communicate with a lot of those systems that I just mentioned. Okay. Let's see here. So then we have this constant battle between new technologies and our old strategies. So we have to constantly reinvent ourselves to make sure that we are staying at the forefront for our customers. The companies that don't innovate on their e-commerce platform die. And so there are plenty of examples of that. Okay. Some of you may know what Montgomery Ward is. Okay. It was a department store. At its peak, it was in every mall or almost every mall in the country. They haven't existed for 20 years. They went out of business during the dot-com boom. and they went out of business for a number of reasons. But I wonder if part of the reason they went out of business is because they didn't adapt to e-commerce. Okay. Sears is another example. Sears is a shell of its former self. Sears was the Amazon.com of its day. In the last century, that's how you bought things when you didn't have a store nearby. You ordered from a catalog. They invented that. They could have easily made that a digital process, but they failed miserably at doing it. And so now Sears is very few stores. Okay. Things like the society. So, we now have a vast majority of the population in the US using the internet, and many people use e-commerce. Now, there are people who don't use e-commerce at all, and I can give an example. My grandmother, not that old, my grandmother's still alive, but she doesn't use e-commerce at all. She doesn't have internet access. She doesn't have a smartphone. She doesn't have a computer. She has cable TV, but she doesn't buy anything online. She goes to the store when she needs something. Okay? So there are still pockets where there is no e-commerce, but for the most part, many people in the US use e-commerce. Okay? There are people who are fearful of online shopping and e-commerce because of privacy concerns. Okay? Security as well. There's also the issue of intellectual property. Okay? Um, if let's say I'm a book author, okay, and I write a book. If I sell that online, the net cost of each copy of that book is zero, okay, effectively zero, once I've paid for the cost of development of the book. Okay. So the net cost of each additional book is zero. So digital content can be very lucrative for people who create it. So it's a great way to make some money if you're good at creating digital content. And there's a lot of people who sell it online and people pay for it. Okay. But there are also issues like stealing of the intellectual property. And so normally this is the time of the course where I would ask you, how many of you have shared a music file that you downloaded? That's someone's intellectual property that they created. And by sharing it, you're denying them the ability to earn money from the product they produced for you. If that was a CD or a DVD, you would be probably less likely to permanently share that with someone else. Now, you might give your CD to a friend to listen to, but that's vastly different than taking that CD and making a copy of it. Something about that physical copy discourages us from doing so. Now, a DVD would be very difficult to copy because you'd have to break the encryption on it and the copy protection, which is a violation of federal law, and you could go to jail for that. But a CD doesn't have that type of protection on it. So, a CD is conceivable that people can do that. But the reality is, with a CD, most people wouldn't think of or just wouldn't bother copying the CD. They would just go purchase one. With digital content, it's so easy to copy it. I think we forget about that's someone's property that they have created and spent the time on. And if you're a musician, you know what I'm talking about. You care about your craft and you produce something and it takes you time to do so. So when someone gives that to someone else without paying for it, that can really hurt your capabilities. So this is something that on an e-commerce platform, there's both a policy and legal perspective, but there's also the technological need to protect that. Okay, so if you've ever effectively stolen someone else's music or movie and shared it with your friend, you might want to reconsider. That's highly unethical. It's also illegal. E-commerce. So there are different aspects of e-commerce that we think about within the academic areas. So computer scientists are thinking about it from the application of that technology. Okay, so computer scientists think about the computers themselves, the software, the internet connectivity, encryption, databases, etc. Okay, on the other side, we have information systems majors who maybe when they get a PhD in information systems, they start researching e-commerce in terms of the business side of things. So value chains, industry structure, your corporate strategy, and consumer behavior. Okay. And then economists think about pricing, consumer behaviors, and then unique features of electronic markets. Okay. And then if you're a marketing major, maybe you think about how do you do branding? How do you do your marketing? What about consumer behaviors? And then how do you use e-commerce technologies to target different groups of people? Okay. So there's a lot of different areas that the academic side can go into in terms of e-commerce, and it really depends on where your interest is. Okay. And it's pretty broad across the spectrum of e-commerce as to which areas and which majors investigate these things. Okay. And then the last area that I'm going to talk about is careers in e-commerce. I'm just going to touch on this real quick. Okay, so I've worked for e-commerce companies in the past. It's been a while since I've worked for an actual company that does consumer e-commerce, but I have worked for those companies earlier in my career. And so you could do anything from managing the product mix on the actual website to monitoring customer behaviors and being a buyer for new products. You could do the marketing side. You could be on the user experience side and developing new user experiences for how they browse and search for products. I mentioned you could be the person managing the item and category pages, what graphics go there, reviews, content. You could help with customer discovery of products. By the way, if this is an area of interest to you, companies like Walmart Labs down in Carlsbad might be of interest to you once you graduate and have a little bit of experience under your belt. Okay, optimizing of pricing. So pricing is like a whole area where people spend a lot of their time. So you could think about how do you optimize pricing of your products. Okay, you could look at product performance and trends. You could think about how you can improve revenue as an organization. How do you improve your customer service, and what can you do about improving your margins? You could work on customer relationships, so you could really focus on customer success. You could be on the supply chain side as well. Okay? So how do you succeed in these roles? Well, the book tells you some things, and I'm not going to go through those. Okay, you can read those for yourself there on the 2019 edition there on page 44. But in general, you need to be able to be versatile and be willing to learn. You have to have an attention to detail. You have to be able to write. Writing is very important, and pretty much every job that you do, you need to be able to write. Okay? I write all the time for my job, and everybody in the organization that I work for writes for their job. Okay, so you have to be able to communicate in a written format. You also have to be able to communicate in an oral format. So I'm sorry, if you're an introvert, I'm an introvert as well. Maybe you don't believe me, but I am. You have to be able to speak. You have to be able to articulate things verbally. You can't get by never speaking. Okay? You have to speak up in meetings. You have to have that capability. You have to have analytical reasoning skills, critical thinking skills. Another skill that I think is very important is experimentation. Whether you're in a technical role or not, you have to be willing to experiment. And not only experiment, but also embrace failure. You're going to fail. You have to be able to learn from those experiences. If you are so stubborn that you believe you've never failed and you will never fail, you have not learned anything. Okay? So make sure that you are willing to embrace failures and that you're going to learn from those failures. Okay? Interviewing, you need to be able to understand the company that you're going to talk to. So do your background investigation. Okay? Learn about the interviewers. If you have any idea who the interviewers are, and a lot of times you'll be told, maybe not in the first interview, but you'll be told in other interviews probably who the interviewers are. Do some research. Go out to their LinkedIn profile. Don't go to their Facebook page. That's just creepy. But go to their LinkedIn page and do some research on them. Learn about their career. What did they do? Maybe there's some commonality there. Maybe they worked for GE and your dad worked for GE. And so maybe your dad used to tell stories about GE's aircraft division or something. Okay, so think about that sort of thing when you're doing your interviewing. Come up with questions. So I recommend the STAR method that Amazon uses. So there's a lot of material on the internet if you Google the Amazon STAR method. But what you're trying to find is a situation where you had a particular scenario happen. So you're going to get asked a question. You're going to be prepared ahead of time. You're going to be given, I would hope that you're going to be given information ahead of time. And if not, ask the recruiter about what the interview is going to be about. And they should be able to tell you what it's going to be about so you can prepare for it. Okay. But use the STAR method to give concrete examples. Now, I understand if you're a student, you don't probably have a lot of real world experience. That's why internships are important. But if you can't get an internship, or you did get an internship and you didn't learn much, then volunteer. Find opportunities to volunteer for nonprofits. That's experience as well. Do projects within college. Okay. Offer to do research for professors. Full professors, I should clarify that statement. Offer to help full professors who have tenure or are tenure track with their research. They're always looking for undergraduate students to help them. Okay, so take advantage of that. Find a professor who's a full professor and ask them, hey, can I help you with any research projects? That's experience that you can get for your resume. Leverage school projects for experience. So if I'm not giving you a project in this class for COVID, but if you're in a class where you're given a project, find out how you can leverage that for the benefit of your resume and the interview process. Okay. And then lastly, be personable. Okay. Make sure that you're friendly and polite and conduct yourself in a professional manner. Okay. So the book has some questions that you could ask. I honestly think you should just go Google the STAR method and then go look out on Glassdoor and other places to see interview questions for the types of roles that you're interested in. Chances are someone has posted details of what questions they were asked in their interview at most larger companies. And you can use those larger company examples for smaller companies. Okay? And that is it for this chapter.